it seems like virtually every member of the Trump administration is now being confronted in public. Like this sort of thing is happening all the time. And it ranges from current members of the Trump administration to past members of the Trump administration. So the latest such incident happened over the weekend. So apparently Stephen Miller, who's sort of the president's immigration guru, former Jeff Sessions acolyte, he apparently ordered $80 of takeout sushi, this is according to the Washington Post, from a restaurant near his apartment. A bartender followed him into the street and shouted, "Stephen." When Miller turned around, the bartender raised both middle fingers and cursed at him, according to an account Miller has shared with White House colleagues. Outraged, Miller threw the sushi away, he later told colleagues. I'm not sure why you would throw away the sushi. The sushi's probably still pretty good. It seems like a waste of perfectly good sushi. Give it to a homeless person or something if you're not going to eat it. But in any case, this just demonstrates the vile behavior that too many on the right are experiencing. Mitch McConnell was confronted on the street over the weekend, and people were telling him that they knew where he lived, to which Cocaine Mitch responded, "I work hard for this." And then he snorted a line and took out his machine gun. So Cocaine Mitch is not going to be having any of that. He just unleashed Elaine Chao, and Elaine Chao came out just like claws unleashed like Wolverine. So you want to go to the McConnell house? Get ready, gang. Get ready, gang. I mean, that dude has been... Have you ever seen Narcos? Okay, this is why you don't go up to a cocaine dealer and say you know where he lives. So here's what it looked like over the weekend when someone went up to Cocaine Mitch.
Yeah. Vote you out! Vote you out! Vote you out!
What are you doing to get the babies back?
Yeah, we know where you live too, Mitch. We know where you live. Yeah! We know where you live, Mitch.
Abolish ICE!
Abolish ICE!
Abolish ICE!
Okay, so screaming at people that you know where they live is always a really delightful mode of political expression. As someone who's received a number of death threats and who has a shotgun for precisely this purpose, I promise you that Mitch McConnell is not all that worried about people knowing where he lives. Again, the extremism of folks on the left who feel the need to do this is pretty astonishing. The same thing happened to Steve Bannon. Now, as you know, Steve Bannon, former White House chief strategist, Sloppy Steve, as the president so memorably named him, I am not a fan of Sloppy Steve. I've been a not fan of Sloppy Steve for many years. In fact, I was one of the first not fans of Sloppy Steve. Right? I in the pages of the Washington Post, I talked about the shortcomings of Sloppy Steve as a human being. When I quit Breitbart News, I talked about how Sloppy Steve was not a great person, to say the least. Okay, but Sloppy Steve still has a right to go to a bookstore. Okay, Steve Bannon still has a right to go to a bookstore. Dude's an inveterate reader, and he likes going to bookstores. So he went to a bookstore, apparently, in Richmond, Virginia. And the bookstore was called it's called Black Swan Books. And some idiot person, this woman, came up to him in the aisles and started yelling at him in the bookstore, which is just a delightful thing to do, right? Listen, again, I dislike Steve Bannon, which is why I avoid him. I have a lot more cause to dislike Steve Bannon than some random woman at a bookstore. She starts yelling at Steve Bannon in the bookstore because she's a jerk. And the owner of the bookstore, whose name is Nick Cook, he promptly asked her to leave. And she said no. And he said, well, if you don't leave, I'm going to call the cops on you. At which point she left. He said this was the end of the story. However, it was not the end of the story because it turns out the left is awful. So a bunch of folks on the left, including a former Hillary staffer, decided it was time to dox the bookstore owner. It was time to go after the bookstore owner for having the temerity to say, customers in my store ought not be abused on my premises. Like, forget whether or not you like Steve Bannon. Forget whether or not Steve Bannon is in there buying books you don't like. None of that matters. If you are a store owner, if I own a restaurant and randos keep invading my restaurant and yelling at the customers, I'm going to call the cops because I run a restaurant. But this, according to the left, is not acceptable in any way. So you have this guy, Raphael Shimonov, who is a techie political artist, who apparently started going through the history of the bookstore owner and goes after the guy's wife because his wife was, I guess, a national Episcopal treasurer. And then there's a correspondent for Raw Story who said that Nick Cook won't tolerate anyone calling out white supremacy even after the fatal alt-right march in Charlottesville. He wants everyone to know his store is a safe place for fascism. Or maybe his store is just a safe place for his customers. And then there's a TV writer who suggested that this bookstore thinks Steve Bannon should be allowed to shop peacefully. Well, it's going to be pretty peaceful there when everyone stops shopping at this bookstore. So now, unless you allow people to harass people on your premises, we are going to destroy your business. Just delightful. This sort of delightful behavior is certainly likely to drive more people into Donald Trump's camp. There is just no question. There's no question. And it should drive people into Donald Trump's camp because the extremism of the left is making it unpalatable for people in the center to vote for them.